My name is Maya Sterling. I am 27 years old. On a Tuesday morning that seemed perfectly normal, I walked into the main conference room of Horizon Dynamics. I had worked there for 5 years, starting as a junior analyst and working my way up to senior operations manager. I was the person who kept the gears turning. I was the one who stayed until 10 at night to fix the errors that everyone else missed. I loved my job, or at least I thought I did. But as I opened the heavy glass doors, I felt a strange chill in the air. My boss, Arthur Vance, was standing at the head of the long oak table. He didn't look at me. He was looking at a young man sitting in the seat that was usually mine. This man looked like he was barely out of college, wearing a suit that cost more than my car. The room was full of my colleagues, and they were all staring at their laps. No one said hello. No one offered me a seat. I stood by the door, holding my tablet, waiting for an explanation. I didn't know it yet, but my life was about to change. Arthur Vance cleared his throat and finally looked in my direction, but his eyes were cold. "Maya, you're late," he said, though the clock on the wall showed I was exactly on time. He didn't wait for me to sit down. He just turned back to the group. "Team, I have a very exciting announcement," he beamed. "As Horizon Dynamics moves into the new fiscal year, we need fresh blood and high-level vision. That is why I am thrilled to introduce Julian Thorne. Julian will be taking over as the new Director of Operations, effective immediately." My heart stopped. Director of Operations was the promotion I had been promised for 6 months. I had already written the expansion plan. I had already secured the vendor contracts. Arthur continued, "Julian comes to us with a prestigious pedigree and a wealth of theoretical knowledge. He will be assuming all responsibilities previously held by Maya." A soft gasp went through the room, but Arthur didn't stop. He explained that I would spend the next 2 weeks training Julian before being reassigned. We all knew what reassign meant. It meant I was being fired in slow motion. I just stood there frozen, as Julian gave a smug, self-satisfied smile. I should have been angry. I should have screamed or walked out. But instead, a strange calmness washed over me. I looked at Arthur, then at Julian, and I smiled. I let him finish his speech. I let him talk about how Julian was going to revolutionize the department. I even nodded when Julian mentioned he wanted to trim the fat from our current budget. They had no idea who they were dealing with. They saw a quiet, hard-working woman who followed orders. They didn't see the woman who had spent the last 3 years building a massive, independent empire under their very noses. While Arthur was busy playing golf and Julian was busy networking at Ivy League parties, I had been coding, investing, and growing. I was not just an employee of Horizon Dynamics. I was the silent owner of the very ground they stood on. But I wasn't going to tell them that yet. I was going to let them enjoy their little victory. I was going to watch them fail because they had forgotten the most important rule of business. Never underestimate the person who knows where all the bodies are buried. To understand how I got here, we have to go back to 2021. I was 22, a fresh graduate with a degree in systems engineering. I landed a job at Horizon Dynamics, which was then a small logistics firm. My father had always told me that hard work was the only way to get ahead. He was a janitor who never missed a day of work in 40 years. My mother was a seamstress. We didn't have a prestigious name like the Thorns or the Vances. We had grit. When I started, Horizon was a mess. Their software was outdated, and their tracking systems were manual. I spent my weekends writing scripts to automate their workflow. I didn't ask for extra pay. I just wanted the system to work. Within a year, I had saved the company $2 million in overhead costs. Arthur Vance noticed, of course. He gave me a pat on the back and a 5% raise. He told me I was part of the family. That was my first lesson in corporate lies. Families don't exploit your labor for pennies while they buy beach houses in Malibu. I realized then that if I wanted real wealth, I would have to build it myself. In late 2022, I started a side project called Catalyst Systems. It was a cloud-based logistics platform that used artificial intelligence to predict supply chain disruptions. I used the knowledge I gained at Horizon to build something 10 times better than what they used. I worked on Catalyst from midnight until 4 in the morning every single day. I lived in a tiny studio apartment ate ramen noodles, and poured every spare cent into server costs and legal fees. By 2023, Catalyst had its first major client, a global shipping giant. They didn't know I was a 24-year-old girl working from a kitchen table. They just knew the software worked. By the end of that year, Catalyst was generating $5 million in annual recurring revenue. I didn't buy a fancy car or a new house. I stayed in my studio apartment. I kept my job at Horizon. I used Horizon's resources to stay updated on the industry, and I used my salary to pay for my health insurance. It was the perfect setup. I was an invisible titan, hiding in plain sight as a diligent assistant to men who thought they were geniuses. By 2024, Catalyst Systems was no longer a side project. It was a dominant force in the industry. We had grown to a team of 40 remote developers and sales reps. I managed them all through encrypted channels. My employees didn't even know my real name. They knew me as the architect. We were profitable, debt-free, and expanding into European markets. Meanwhile, at Horizon Dynamics, things were starting to crumble. Arthur Vance had made several bad investments. He had spent too much on a flashy new headquarters and not enough on maintaining his core infrastructure. He started relying on me more and more to fix things. I did, because every time I fixed a problem at Horizon, I learned how to avoid that same problem at Catalyst. I was essentially being paid by Arthur to research how to crush his own company. It sounds cold, but business is a battlefield. Arthur had plenty of chances to reward my loyalty. Instead, he took the credit for my ideas and used them to secure loans that kept his failing lifestyle afloat. He was a hollow man in a tailored suit. In early 2025, a massive opportunity arrived. The land that the Horizon Dynamics headquarters sat on was being sold by the city. The city wanted a private developer to take over the lease and modernize the entire industrial park. Arthur was too distracted by his divorce and his new yacht to notice the public notice. I noticed. I formed a shell company called Sterling Holdings. Through Sterling, I put in a bid for the land that was so high and so well structured that the city council approved it in record time. I didn't just buy the land, I bought the water rights and the access roads. I became Arthur Vance's landlord without him ever knowing. I also started buying up Horizon's debt through third-party collection agencies. By the summer of 2025, I owned 40% of Horizon's outstanding loans. I was effectively the shadow owner of the company. I could have walked in and fired Arthur then, but I wanted to see if he would ever do the right thing. I wanted to see if he would finally give me the promotion he had promised. The promotion talks started in August 2025. Arthur sat me down and told me that the director of operations position would be opening up. "Maya, you're the backbone of this place," he said with that fake, fatherly smile. "I'm moving the current director to the London office, and I want you to step up. This is your moment." I felt a tiny spark of hope. Maybe I didn't have to destroy him. Maybe we could grow together. I spent the next 3 months working 80-hour weeks. I created a 5-year growth plan for Horizon that would have integrated Catalyst technology for free to save the company from bankruptcy. I was ready to save him. But then came that Tuesday morning in the conference room. Arthur didn't give me the promotion. He gave it to Julian Thorne, the son of one of his golfing buddies. Julian didn't know a spreadsheet from a grocery list. He was there to look good and take the salary I had earned. As I stood there listening to Arthur praise Julian's vision, that spark of hope died. It was replaced by a cold, hard resolve. After the meeting ended, Arthur called me into his office. He wouldn't look me in the eye. "Maya, I know you're disappointed," he said, fiddling with a gold pen. "But Julian has connections we need. He's Ivy League, and that carries weight with the board. You're great at the technical stuff, but you lack the social polish for a director role. I want you to spend the next 2 weeks showing Julian the ropes. If you do a good job, I'll make sure your severance package is generous." I smiled at him. "I understand perfectly, Arthur," I said. "I will make sure Julian has everything he needs to succeed." Arthur looked relieved. He probably thought I was going to cry or quit on the spot. He didn't realize that by everything he needs, I meant I was going to hand Julian a ticking time bomb. I left his office and went to my desk. I didn't pack my things. I just opened my laptop and sent a single message to my legal team at Sterling Holdings. Initiate the lease audit for 472 Industrial Way. Start the debt call-in process for Horizon Dynamics. We move in 14 days. The first day of training Julian was a comedy of errors. He showed up at 10:30 in the morning, smelling like expensive cologne and holding a latte. So, Maya, he said, leaning against my desk, just show me where the main files are and how to approve the expenses. I've got a lunch meeting at 12, so let's make it quick. I smiled and pulled up the most complex, tangled spreadsheets in the system. Of course, Julian, I said. We'll start with the multi-tier logistics integration. This is the heart of the company. I spent 3 hours explaining technical jargon that I knew went right over his head. I watched his eyes glaze over as I talked about API hooks and recursive database queries. He just kept nodding and saying, right, got it? By the time he left for lunch, he had signed 3 routine authorization forms I had placed in his inbox. He didn't read them. If he had, he would have seen that he just authorized the transfer of all proprietary data backups to an external server, one owned by Catalyst Systems. By the end of the first week, Julian was convinced he was a genius. I praised every stupid idea he had. When he suggested we stop using the expensive tracking software and switch to a cheaper alternative he found online, I told him it was a brilliant cost-cutting measure. I didn't tell him that the cheaper alternative was actually a shell program I had created that would stop working the moment I logged out for the last time. Julian was so busy bragging to Arthur about how much money he was saving that he didn't notice the warnings from our vendors. The vendors were calling because Sterling Holdings had started buying up their contracts. Within 5 days, every major supplier Horizon used was now technically a subsidiary of my company. I was Julian's boss, Arthur's landlord, and the company's primary creditor. I was the air they breathed, and I was about to cut off the oxygen. I spent my evenings at my studio apartment watching the Horizon stock price slowly dip as rumors of management changes started to leak to the press. On Wednesday of the second week, Arthur called an emergency meeting. He looked panicked. Maya, Julian, we have a problem, he said, pacing the room. The bank just called. They're calling in our line of credit. They say our debt-to-income ratio is too high. And the landlord for the building just sent over a notice of a 10% rent increase and a mandatory building inspection. Julian looked confused. But we're doing great. I just cut 20% from the tech budget. Arthur glared at him. That's not how banks work, Julian. We need cash and we need it now. I sat there quietly, taking notes. Arthur turned to me. Maya, you know the books better than anyone. Is there any hidden reserve? Any way to stall the bank? I looked at my tablet and pretended to check the numbers. I'm afraid not, Arthur, I said softly. The debt was recently sold to a private equity firm called Sterling Holdings. They are very aggressive. They aren't looking to stall. They're looking for a takeover. Arthur's face went pale. Sterling Holdings? Who the hell are they? I don't know, Arthur, I lied smoothly. But I did see a letter from them in the morning mail. They're requesting a face-to-face meeting this Friday at noon. They say they want to discuss the future of the facility. Arthur slumped into his chair. This is a nightmare. Julian, you need to call your father. Maybe he can talk to the board. Julian stammered something about his father being on a safari in Africa and being unreachable. It was pathetic. These men had spent their whole lives relying on names and connections, and now that the world was demanding actual competence, they were drowning. I stood up and offered to bring them some coffee. You both look stressed, I said with a sympathetic smile. Let me handle the paperwork for the Friday meeting. I'll make sure everything is in order. Arthur thanked me, calling me a lifesaver. He still had no idea that I was the one who had pulled the plug on his life support. I walked back to my desk and finalized the press release for Monday morning. Friday morning arrived. The atmosphere at Horizon Dynamics was like a funeral. Most of the staff knew something was wrong. Paychecks had been delayed by a day, and the cheaper software Julian had implemented was causing orders to be lost in the system. Customers were screaming on the phones. Julian was hiding in his office, and Arthur was in the conference room, staring at the door. He had his best suit on, trying to look like a man who was still in control. At exactly noon, the doorbell to the office rang. Arthur stood up, smoothing his tie. Julian, come on, he shouted. This is it. I walked toward the conference room, but I didn't go inside. I stood in the hallway, watching as two men in dark suits entered. They were my lawyers. They walked past Arthur and Julian without shaking hands and took their seats at the table. Mr. Vance, one of them said, we represent Sterling Holdings. We are here to discuss your immediate exit from this property and the liquidation of your remaining assets to cover your outstanding debts. Arthur started to shout. This is an outrage. You can't just kick us out. We have a lease. The lawyer calmly pulled out a folder. Actually, Mr. Vance, you violated the terms of your lease when you failed to maintain the required insurance levels last month. Furthermore, Sterling Holdings now owns 80% of your corporate debt. We have the legal right to seize your equipment and intellectual property as collateral. Arthur turned to Julian. Do something. Call the lawyers. Julian was shaking. I don't know what to do, he whispered. Arthur let out a roar of frustration and then looked toward the door. Maya, he screamed. Maya, get in here. Where are the files? Where's the insurance proof? I stepped into the room, but I didn't have my tablet or my notepad. I was wearing a sharp, tailored blazer I had hidden in my car that morning. I walked to the head of the table, the seat Julian had taken from me, and sat down. Arthur stared at me. Maya, what are you doing? Get up. I looked Arthur Vance directly in the eye and smiled. It was the same smile I had given him 2 weeks ago when he announced my replacement. I'm not getting up, Arthur, I said, my voice steady and clear. Because I am the owner of Sterling Holdings. I am also the founder of Catalyst Systems. And as of 5 minutes ago, I am the sole owner of Horizon Dynamics. The room went so silent you could hear the clock ticking on the wall. Arthur's mouth opened and closed like a fish out of water. Julian looked like he was going to faint. You, Arthur finally gasped. You're Maya. You're an assistant. I leaned forward. I was the person who built this company while you were busy spending money you didn't have. I was the person you thought wasn't polished enough for a promotion. Well, Arthur, I may not have an Ivy League degree, but I have your company. And I have your building. And I have your debt. I turned to my lawyers. Please present Mr. Vance and Mr. Thorne with their termination papers. The next hour was a blur of chaos and satisfaction. Arthur tried to plead with me. Maya, we can work this out. I'll make you a partner. I'll give you whatever you want. I just shook my head. You had 5 years to give me what I earned, Arthur. You chose Julian instead. Now, Julian can help you pack your things. Julian tried to say something about his career, but I cut him off. Julian, you've been here 2 weeks and you've managed to lose 3 major clients and crash our tracking system. You aren't a director of operations. You're a liability. Security escorted them both out of the building in front of the entire staff. The office was quiet for a moment, and then, slowly, people started to clap. My colleagues knew who had been doing the work. They knew who actually cared about the company. I stood up and walked into the main office area. Everyone, listen up, I shouted. Paychecks will be issued in full by the end of the day. We are rebranding as Catalyst Horizon. Things are going to change, and they're going to change for the better. The transition was hard work, but for the first time, it was my work. I moved my office into Arthur's old suite, but I tore down the mahogany walls and made it open and transparent. I hired a new management team based on merit, not connections. I promoted the quiet workers who had been overlooked for years. Within 6 months, Catalyst Horizon was the most profitable logistics firm in the country. Arthur Vance ended up in a messy legal battle over his remaining debts and lost his yacht and his beach house. Julian Thorne went back to living on his father's allowance, his Ivy League reputation ruined by the story of how a tech girl had outsmarted him. I finally bought a house, a beautiful, modern home with a view of the city. I invited my parents over for dinner. My father looked at the house and then at me, tears in his eyes. You did it, Maya, he said. You worked hard. I smiled and hugged him. I did, Dad. But I also worked smart. I realized that the reassignment Arthur had planned for me was actually a gift. By trying to replace me, he forced me to stop being an employee and start being a leader. He forced me to show my hand. I no longer had to hide in the shadows. I was the CEO of a company worth hundreds of millions of dollars. I was featured on the cover of business magazines, not as a socially polished figurehead, but as a technical visionary. I started a foundation to help young women from working class backgrounds get into systems engineering. I wanted to make sure they knew that they didn't need a fancy name or a gold pen to succeed. They just needed the grit to build their own empire and the patience to wait for the right moment to claim it. Every time I walk into my office and see the Catalyst Horizon logo, I remember that Tuesday morning. I remember the cold conference room and the smug smile on Julian's face. And I smile back, knowing that I let him finish what he started so I could finish it for good. The story of my replacement became a legend in the industry. It was a warning to every old school boss who thought they could exploit their best talent without consequences. I received letters from employees all over the world who were inspired to start their own side projects. I told them all the same thing. Be invisible until you are invincible. Don't waste your energy fighting small battles. Save it for the war. Arthur Vance eventually tried to sue me for breach of fiduciary duty, claiming I used company time to build Catalyst. My lawyers pointed out that I did all my Catalyst work outside of office hours and that my scripts actually saved Horizon millions. The judge laughed the case out of court. Arthur was left with nothing but his bitterness. I didn't feel sorry for him. He had every opportunity to be a good man, but he chose to be a powerful one instead. He didn't realize that real power comes from the people who actually know how things work. By 2026, Catalyst Horizon had expanded into automated trucking and drone delivery. We were no longer just a logistics firm. We were a technology giant. My net worth was estimated at over $500 million. I still worked long hours, but now I did it because I loved the challenge, not because I was afraid of losing my job. I had a board of directors that actually respected me, and a team that would follow me anywhere. I kept that $89 Target dress I wore the day I took over the company. I kept it in a frame in my office as a reminder of where I came from. It was a symbol of the unpolished girl who took down the Ivy League giant. My life was full not of social polish, but of real, meaningful success. I had stayed true to my roots while building a future that no one thought was possible for a girl like me. I was the architect of my own destiny. One afternoon, I was sitting in a cafe when I saw a familiar face. It was Julian Thorne. He looked older, tired, and was wearing a cheap, off-the-rack suit. He was working as a junior sales rep for a small insurance company. He didn't see me at first, but when he did, he froze. He looked like he wanted to run away. I just nodded at him and went back to my book. I didn't need to say anything. The look on his face told me everything I needed to know. He knew who I was, and he knew what he had lost. He had been a pawn in Arthur's game, and he had paid the price for his own arrogance. I felt a brief moment of pity for him, but it passed quickly. He had been given every advantage in life, and had done nothing with it. I had been given nothing and had built the world. That was the difference between us. That was why I was sitting in the CEO's chair and he was selling insurance. My parents eventually moved into a beautiful retirement community I built for them. They didn't have to worry about money ever again. My father still insisted on fixing his own leaky faucets, and my mother still sewed her own curtains, but they did it in a house that was safe and warm. They were proud of me, not for the money, but for the fact that I had remained the same Maya they had raised. I hadn't let the corporate world change my soul. I was still the girl who cared about the details and the girl who wasn't afraid of hard work. I just had a bigger platform to show it. I realized that my father's lesson about hard work was only half the truth. The other half was about knowing your worth. If you don't value yourself, no one else will. You have to be willing to stand up and say, I am the one who built this. And if they don't believe you, you have to be willing to take it all away. As I look toward the future, I see a world where competence matters more than names. I see a world where the Mayas are the ones leading the way, and the Julians are a relic of the past. I am committed to making that world a reality. I am investing in education, in technology, and in the people who have been overlooked. I am building a legacy that will last long after I am gone. And it all started with a smile in a cold conference room. It started when I realized that being replaced was the best thing that ever happened to me. It was the catalyst for my own transformation. I am no longer an employee. I am no longer an assistant. I am the owner. I am the leader. I am the architect. And I am just getting started. The world is full of Arthur Van Cess and Julian Thorns, but it is also full of people like me. And we are the ones who are going to win. So if you're reading this and you're feeling stuck or undervalued or like you're being replaced, don't despair. Don't scream and don't quit in a huff. Just smile. Let them finish what they started. Let them think they've won. And while they're busy celebrating their victory, you keep building. Keep coding, keep planning, and keep growing because your time is coming. And when it does, it will be more brutal and more beautiful than they can ever imagine. You will walk into that room and you will take your seat at the head of the table. And you will realize that they didn't replace you. They just gave you the space to become who you were always meant to be. My name is Maya Sterling, and I let my boss replace me. It was the smartest thing I ever did. Now I own the room, the building, and the future. And I've never been happier.